One of the worst nights of my life was December 28th, 2013. To put it bluntly, and in as few words as possible, a tough Christmas had been rough on my mental health. Then a straight-up shouting match with my mom just kind of finished me off. I stormed out of our family home, screaming profanity and swearing that they'd never see me again. Yep, I was that petulant teenager. Sure, I'd forgotten my phone and wallet, but was I way too proud to go back and get them? You bet I was. So in my fit of only partially warranted rage, I somehow decided it would be a good idea to try to hitchhike to my friend's house so I could stay the night there. I'd never hitchhiked before. I don't think I'd even held my thumb out for a cab at this point in my life. But there I was, stood on a stretch of Florida highway trying to catch the attention of a passing driver. To my surprise, someone actually pulled over pretty quickly. And not the hippie bus rust bucket I've been visualizing either. It was one of those high-end Chevys, I'm not sure which model, and the guy behind the wheel looked like he had a few dollars. I mean, he was the archetypical rich dad type, absolutely nothing to indicate that he was anything but nice and well-meaning. "Hop in," he calls out from the open passenger window. I couldn't believe my luck. Like, not only was I about to actually hitchhike for the first time, which felt pretty cool, not gonna lie, but I was about to do it in style. I can't tell the difference between faux leather and the real deal, but when you're in an air-conditioned sedan that still has that new car smell at 17, who cares? You feel as grown-up as you can. So the guy asked me why I'm hitchhiking, and I'll be honest. I may have given him a totally hopped-up version of events which totally made me out to be the victim. Abusive parents, poor me, blah blah blah. Naturally, he takes this as gospel and starts telling me how his father was an alcoholic, how he sympathized with my situation. I asked him to take me as far down the road as he could, and that I had a friend that lived about 30 minutes drive away. He says cool, and down the highway we go. As he's driving, we talk a lot more about family. He pops the glove box and boom, there's a picture of his kids. As I'm looking at his little girls, he starts telling me how important he thinks family is, especially to those of us that come from less than stable backgrounds. Then he said something that seemed completely out of character. We're pulling into a gas station after he mentions needing to fill up, continuing the family convo in segments, if that makes any sense. One minute he'll stop talking because he needs to focus on a turn or a lane switch, then he carries on. So it was almost out of nowhere when he says something like, "We have to protect our families from our true natures." I didn't know what to say to that. Not in the moment, so I just kind of stayed quiet as he gets out of the car and starts filling up the tank. I had a few minutes to process those words, and the more I thought about them, the more I realized that hitchhiking might not have been such a good idea. When he gets back in after paying for the gas, there's a few moments of quiet as I'm still trying to work out just what he meant by his last statement. So I just asked. I straight up asked him what he meant by something so ominous. "It'll be easier if I show you." Ever wonder what it would feel like to tuck and roll out of a moving vehicle? Ever try to imagine it because you're literally about to do it and you're pretty sure it'd kill you at the speeds you're traveling? Probably not. I hadn't. Not until that moment right there. But somehow I convinced myself that I was just being overly dramatic. Too little too late, huh? So I just stayed in the car. I didn't even ask for him to pull over or anything. Christ, looking back at it, I wasn't sure what was going through my head at all. Just that I really didn't want to be around this guy anymore. He'd gone from nice and normal to moody and creepy in light speed. You know, everyone has secrets. He says after pulling into a dark commercial lot and shutting the engine off. So imagine that line spoken as creepily as you can imagine, then double it, and that's what this guy sounded like. I kept my tone polite up until that point, like I needed this dude to get to my friend's house, but I was all out of cool by then, and I'm literally about to ask him what he's talking about. When he puts his hand on my thigh, doesn't just put it there, he puts his hand there and squeezes. Little side note here, I am not in the least bit homophobic, An older cousin of mine came out as gay long before this ever happened, and aside from a great uncle whose mentality seems to be firmly rooted in the 1920s, everyone in the family just accepted him for who he is. So this isn't me like, oh god, it was scary because a gay dude touched me, because really I don't think this guy was even gay. Like I said, he had pictures of his kid, mentioned his wife, even complained about his in-laws a little during our little family talk. Not that that rules out him being in the closet. Look, what I'm trying to say is, he did what he did because he was a predator. He saw someone vulnerable, he apparently had a rough childhood or family background, and saw someone he could manipulate. It was the look in his eyes, man, not this vulnerable I like you look. It was like a hunger. That's the only way I can describe it. Like an excitement before a feast. I just hit him. I'm not some tough guy. I don't do MMA. I don't think I've even landed the punch properly, but I threw it hard enough to let him know that he was not about to have his way with me in a dark parking lot in the middle of winter. Then I tried to undo my seatbelt. Tried being the operative word. I pushed the little red button and absolutely nothing happened. No clicking or catching of mechanisms, nothing. You should have seen this guy smile when that happened. I will never, ever forget that look in his eye. Pure predator. I'm not even ashamed to admit that I started screaming for help like a little kid. But ever have a nightmare where you try to scream but your voice keeps kinda catching in your throat? It's so scary because it can literally happen. And it happened to me, right there in that dark parking lot. I'm not even entirely sure what happened next. I remember slamming my fist into the glass window and it popping all over me. I know I must have gotten the door open somehow, too. There were headlights behind us, someone shouting as they intervened. The predatory driver reached under his seat, and I thought for a moment that he was about to pull out a gun or something. But then the seatbelt felt kind of loose, so I just kind of rolled out of the car as it sped away. In retrospect, I think the guy had a way to unbuckle it like jury-rigged under his seat, if that makes any sense. I mean, it was incredibly tight and then it just wasn't. Then the cops are there. My rescuer must have called and I'm just numb. Not only because I couldn't believe I'd almost gotten myself kidnapped or whatever. I mean, I have no idea what that guy was planning for me, other than it wasn't good or innocent. But it was the fact that my own foolish pride, my own self-pity and lies, could have been the things really responsible for what could have easily happened, an untimely death. Back when I was in community college, I worked at this pizza place that was basically in the middle of nowhere. It was located in a strip mall at the side of a highway in a pretty rural area, and there were just people dotted around the surrounded area that the store never quite went out of business. But since we hardly made any money, we operated a skeleton crew at all hours, and especially late at night. Sometimes it would just be 2 people in the store, me and one other guy. One would make the pies, and the other would drive them out to the customers. It wasn't always a perfect system, but we managed. Without a doubt, the best time to work was Wednesday or Thursday nights, simply because of how quiet it was. You worked a Wednesday or Thursday late shift and basically got paid to sit around on your butt and talk trash with your coworker. You'd maybe get 1 or 2 calls, nothing stressful, and that was that. But this one night, we get a call almost bang on 11 p.m., a half hour before closing. Any other time, we might actually be kinda angry, but it was just way too out of the ordinary for us to even be mad. Like, I think it was legit the first time we'd ever gotten a call that late. Now at the time, my coworker is out in his car having a quick smoke before we start our clean down, so I'm all on my own when I hear the phone. Part of me was like, just don't answer it, dude. But honestly, curiosity got the best of me. Most of the families in the county work their farms, so they go to bed pretty early in the evening, so who was calling so late? When I pick up, I don't recognize the voice on the end. Given the nature of the job, I pretty much know everyone who calls, along with exactly what they're going to order. But still, it's not entirely unusual that we get someone new calling. But what was really unusual was how this guy's order differed from most others. not to mention how he was acting in general. So right off the bat, I can tell there's something not quite right with the guy. His voice was super raspy, like he lived in a whiskey still and smoked Marlboros for breakfast. And I know it's about to be a weird call when the first thing he asks for is a hamburger. I'm like, "Sir, this is a pizza place. I can read you our menu if you like." Which was no problem. We only had like 6 different pizzas with a couple of sides. The guy says it's fine. All he wants is hamburger meat. I'm assuming he meant on a pizza since we did actually do a cheeseburger pizza at the time, so I asked some clarification. But no, this guy doesn't want a pizza. He just wants hamburger meat. Raw hamburger meat. I don't even know if I'm allowed to sell raw hamburger meat. Like, I know you can eat raw hamburger meat. Like, I'm pretty sure that's what steak tartare is, but I figured there had to be some kind of food hygiene law against it. I asked my coworker, who was way too blazed to give me a solid answer, so I give the guy an honest answer and tell him I'm not even sure I'm allowed to sell him raw hamburger. The guy started begging and pleading so hard that I was actually speechless for a moment. He sounded like he was fiending for it, so bad that it was actually kind of creepy. I'm even less sure about the whole thing by that point, but after the guy on the phone offers a handsome tip, I make an executive decision and decided to go ahead with the sale. People do dumb stuff for money, right? Well, I suppose this is my thing. I throw what I consider to be $10 retail worth of hamburger meat into a plastic carton, plug this guy's address into my navigation system, then began the drive out to his house. I've been making deliveries in that area of Lawrence County for about 18 months at that time. I'm not saying I knew the place like the back of my hand, but I'd certainly never seen this guy's house before. I didn't even know that old place was there. It was some old farmhouse at the end of a long dirt road, and it looked like it was falling apart. It would have made a great haunted house, and all I could think as my headlights suddenly lit the whole place up was that it was like the start of a horror movie or something. I was the poor, dumb pizza boy, doomed to die in the film's intro that introduced whatever crazed killer or monstrous creature that was the movie's main feature. I park up, walk up the old rickety porch, and since there was no sign of a doorbell, I just knock on this guy's door. When he answers, he actually looks pretty normal. Like he'd expect some decrepit old witch to answer the door to a house like that. Not a guy in a sweater vest who looked like the dad of all dads. As I'm handing over the bag of hamburger meat, I can't resist asking him why he'd ordered raw hamburger and not an actual menu item. I figured he's going to grill it at home or whatever, so I frame my question as such. But the guy just smiles, shakes his head, and tells me he's going to eat it raw. I must have completely failed to hide the look of disgusted confusion on my face, because the guy then launches into this big speech about the benefits of eating raw meat. I mean, he talked a lot of science terms that I didn't understand, but he seemed to know what he was talking about, and it actually weirdly put me at ease for a second as he fished around his wallet for a tip. He hands me $11 in crumpled ones, and as I count them, I'm like, "Thanks, man. That's really generous." But then I look up, just in time to see the guy crack the lid on the plastic container of meat, bring it up to his nose, and take a long, deep sniff of what was inside. The way he acted wasn't like this wholesome, smells yummy kind of happy. It seemed straight up perverse. I'm just watching, trying not to freak out, as the smell of the meat seems to legit turn him on. After he huffs it, he shudders, eyes rolling in their sockets before he gets this glazed look in them, and all I'm thinking is, this is my cue to leave. I awkwardly thank the guy, just happy to get off of his property, only right as I go to turn around and walk back off the porch, I see something moving in the dimly lit hallway over the dude's shoulder. Poking out at about waist height from behind a doorframe was this big pair of terrified eyes looking back at me from sunken sockets. It was a kid. I don't even know what compelled me to ask, but whatever it was so strong that it overrode any desire I had to flee while I still had the legs to carry me. I remember saying something like, that your kid, huh? Instead of giving me this big smile or waxing lyrical about what a proud dad they were, something that would have suited his wholesome sweater vest dad look, he suddenly looks furious. He spins around on the spot. The kid looks terrified and disappears from view. Then, when he turns back, he just stares at me, this deep, moody stare that sent a shiver down my spine. And once again, I get that overwhelming "this is my cue to leave" feeling. I thank the guy, backing off the porch in a way where I never quite turn my back on him. He doesn't say a word in response, just keeps that angry look on his face, like I'd done something to offend him or seen something I shouldn't have. It took 20 minutes to drive back to the pizza place. 20 long minutes I had to replay the interaction in my head, over and over again. I called 911 as soon as I got back. Like I had no idea what was going on back there, but it couldn't have been good. No kid should be that scared of their dad, if that guy even was that kid's dad at all. My logic was that I could call 911, find out I just came out at a bad time and took the dude's actions out of context and maybe feel a little embarrassed. Or find out that something horrible was happening in that house, feel horrendous guilt that I failed to stop it, and then be haunted for the rest of my life. Though what I wasn't expecting was that there was actually a third option, one that turned out to be worse than the first two. So, I call the cops. They go to check it out. Then the deputy gets back in touch to reassure me that he'd been over to the guy's house, had a good look around, and then found that there was nothing wrong. I figured that once a cop had told me that, I'd feel fine. Kind of stupid for assuming stuff, but generally fine. But I didn't. I found myself just not believing the guy. Like he couldn't have seen the same stuff that I had and just walked away being like, yeah, it's all good in that house. I didn't do another delivery to that house for the rest of the time I worked there, and I certainly wasn't complaining about not having to make any more weird deliveries. But even today, I find myself wondering what the deal was with that guy and his kid, and whether or not I should have done more to investigate. Because the thing that haunts me the most is that there might be some kind of kid out there going through the most horrifying ordeal of their young lives, thinking like, why didn't that man help me? Why didn't that man help me?
Back in the 1970s, my uncle used to spend a couple of weeks in his hunting cabin that was in the middle of nowhere up in Canada. Most of the time his trips were very relaxing and enjoyable. He would head back home afterwards feeling refreshed, having unplugged from society for a bit. He used to tell me that he had some of the best moments of his life sitting on his front step, watching as the stars faded from the sky and the dawn appear on the horizon. He was a real man of the earth, who enjoyed being one with nature. I'm surprised he never sold his condo and went full Amish. There was one year that nearly derailed his loner lifestyle and scared him so much, he nearly sold the cabin and never went back. It's the most popular story circulated through my extended family, and the reason I always triple check my locks before going to bed. Now, for some context, the cabin wasn't accessible by vehicle, and there was a small amount of hiking involved to reach it. It was about 400 square feet and was made up of a single room. There was no running water and no electricity. It was a wooden structure built upon a small stone foundation, and because of this, there was about a 12-inch space between the ground and the floor of the cabin. There was a trapdoor by the fireplace where he would drop extra logs of firewood, so he wouldn't have to venture outside to collect more. The incident happened in October. It was extremely cold even by Canada standards. When he wasn't at the cabin, he had the front door locked with a padlock, but upon entering, the first thing he noticed was the hint of tobacco in the air. This confused him, because he didn't smoke, and he hadn't been in the cabin since January. But he shrugged it off and got himself settled in. His first order of business was to get a fire going. He lit the lanterns, unpacked, pulled up his chair to the fire, and fell asleep. He woke up several times during the night, always in the state of panic, as if the chair was tipping over and he was falling. But the wind was roaring so hard outside, and the cabin walls were creaking so much, he shrugged it off as paranoia. He eventually left his chair and got into bed. He awoke one more time that night. When dawn was just beginning to peek through the window, he shot up in bed when he heard a loud roar of the wind, and through his haze of sleep, he thought he saw a figure outside the window. He scrambled out of bed, knocking over his chair, grabbed his hunting rifle and bolted across the room and flung open the front door. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, but there weren't any signs of footprints outside. He slammed his door shut, put down his rifle and muttered a few profanities as he righted his chair. He opened the trap door, grabbed a few more logs and put them on the fire, and then went back to bed. It should be noted that the lantern was burning low when he woke up, as was the fire, so there wasn't much light in the room. At about 9 a.m., my uncle woke up to the sun shining brightly through the cabin windows. He got up, warmed some water for coffee by setting the kettle down on the shelf over the fire, and then opened the front door. He said what he saw next nearly gave him a heart attack. There were footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin's front door. My uncle, being his normal impulsive self, threw on some clothes and boots, grabbed his rifle, and followed the footprints through the trees with his gun up, ready for confrontation. The footprints circled up the surrounding hills, and my uncle followed them to a spot where the entrance of the cabin was in plain sight. The intruder had clearly crouched for a long while, then the tracks made off at a good stride further into the woods. Based on the boot size of the footprints, the stranger was just as large as my strapping 6'3" uncle, if not larger, and was clearly expecting my uncle to notice his tracks and come after him, or else he wouldn't have stopped to watch the cabin. He would have continued to run and make his escape. My uncle didn't want to fall into any kind of trap, so he fired a single shot into the air as a warning, and made his way back to the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and opened the trap door by the fireplace. As he poked his head down, he scanned the area under the cabin with a flashlight and discovered one of his own blankets in a dirty, tangled mess in the corner. There were a couple of empty soup cans he recognized from his own pantry, a single spoon, and several dozen small bones, most likely squirrels or rabbits. What my uncle thinks occurred was that somehow an intruder had broken into the cabin while my uncle was away, and had been hiding under the floor the entire time he had been there the previous day. He came to the conclusion that the reason he kept being jolted awake the night before was because half of the chair had been resting on top of the trap door, and whoever was below was trying to escape by lifting the hatch. Later on, when my uncle thought he saw a figure outside the window, he later realized that the figure had actually been inside and was heading for the door, but was interrupted, and the man had likely leapt back down through the trap door when my uncle sprang to life and noisily knocked over his chair. The creepiest thing about all of this wasn't the fact that a complete stranger was hiding so close when my uncle thought he was alone. It was the fact he was hiding in the first place that really calls into question who he was and what his motives were. It was never confirmed how the man broke into the cabin, but was already under the floor when my uncle arrived, which tells me he was going to great lengths to make sure that he wasn't discovered. When he finally emerged from under the floor, he could have killed my uncle in his sleep, but he took the opportunity to run. It's possible that he simply decided that he didn't want to risk a struggle, but I think whoever he is, he was on the run, or at the very least, had something to hide. Earlier the same year in May, not very far away, a 17-year-old girl had gone missing while walking up the road to visit her cousins, and shortly after in August, a 21-year-old woman was found stabbed to death on the very same road the girl had disappeared on. I believe whoever was in my uncle's cabin could very well have had something to do with one or both of these unsolved crimes. My uncle never reported the incident to the police, and to the best of his knowledge, the intruder never returned. But it makes me wonder to this day, are we ever really alone when we think we are? Because if someone could be hiding under the floor in an isolated cabin during the winter, is it really impossible that there could be someone under your bed right now?
For a few years there, Omegle and chat roulette were like the best things ever. I know it sounds dumb, but the idea of coming face to face with random internet people absolutely terrified me at first. I wasn't the most confident of people when I was younger, and believe it or not, using stuff like Omegle actually helped me come out of my shell a little and learn how to talk to people. And naturally, like anyone who spent a lot of time on Omegle, I have a lot of stories detailing some of the weirder encounters I've had on there. I mean, I've had some pretty amazing ones. I met one of my long-term gaming buddies on Omegle, and you'd be surprised at the number of girls who just want to show themselves off, so to speak, every once in a while. But I've also had my share of gross, sad, irritating, and downright scary encounters on Omegle too. And what I'm about to tell you is by far the most disturbing. And it's not some dumb creepypasta either. Every word of this is true. So I just gotten home from this terrible part-time job I was working in 2012, and at the time, my routine was like, get home, sneak one of my stepdad's beers from the garage, and see how palpable the mental illness was on Omegle that afternoon. I was actually having a good run at one point. I had a guy singing that Call Me Maybe song, another dude who did a magic trick, and a handful of pretty girls, and I think one dude was on acid or something. So all in all, I was in a pretty good mood by the time I hit end and knew for what turned out to be the final time of that night. Because when I do, I just see this dude sitting at his desk, staring blankly into the webcam. Immediately this hits me as unusual because most people are looking at their screens to see who you are and not straight up staring into the camera. I said like, "Hey, what's up?" or something. But the dude didn't reply, so I figured that there was just something wrong with his audio. Now I should add that it was usually around this time that I'd just end a chat and start a new one. If the person on the other end seemed too weird or like they wouldn't be much fun, I'd just skip them entirely. So as you can imagine, coupled with all the other weird stuff you're likely to see during an Omegle session, I ended up doing a lot of skipping. But something about this dude really got my attention. At first, when I saw him, he looked like he might be in his early to mid-teens, dark hair and eyes, kind of a baby face with scrawny shoulders. But the more I looked, the older he seemed to be. The guy had crow's feet, deep bags under his eyes, pretty sure he had flecks of gray at his temples too. Like if he was as young as I thought he was, then he must have had the most brutal paper route in history. So for some reason, at a time I'd normally just ghost him, I said, are you okay, dude? Can you hear me?" He nods. He could hear me, and it hit me that this might be another case of someone browsing Omegle while they're high. It might sound a little mean or whatever, but I figured that I'd just mess with him just a little bit. Maybe see if I could guess what kind of drug he was taking. I start talking real slow to him, trying to make him think time is slowing down or something, but he barely reacts. And it's then that I realize that he hasn't looked at his screen or monitor. The whole time, he was literally just staring at this little lens on his webcam. I break from the play acting and just ask him straight up, "What kind of stuff are you on, dude?" He just shakes his head. So I ask him if he means he isn't on any drugs at all, and to that he nods. Now I'm torn between laughing because of what could have been a blatant lie and kind of freaking out because if he wasn't lying, and that was him sober, that made for one real creepy guy. And then out of nowhere, this guy reaches up towards his mouth like he's about to take out some gum or something. At first, I think he's going to show me some weird root he's been chewing on that made him look all sleepy. I mean, if there is such a thing, I was just kind of speculating. I know people can get some pretty weird South American plants and stuff from shady websites. But then it becomes obvious that he has hold of his own tooth. His front tooth, I think. Like in the grip of his thumb and forefinger. And then he starts to pull. I respond, "Dude, what are you doing?" All calm at first. And then he starts really getting a grip on his tooth, pulling it and twisting it. And I respond, Stop! What are you thinking, man?" This all escalates until I hear like a deep cracking sound coming from this guy's mic. He twists the tooth free from his gum as blood starts to pour out of his mouth, then holds it up to the camera like he's all proud of himself. I am full-on squealing at the computer at this point, stuck between wanting to cover my eyes and turn it off, and not being able to look away because of what this guy is even doing. I asked him in like 100 different ways, "Why did you do that? Was it rotten? Can't you go to the dentist?" He doesn't say a word. He just spends a few more seconds smiling with this gap-toothed grin, mopping at the blood on his chin and holding up the tooth in front of the webcam. Then he disappears and I'm left on the new chat screen, just shell-shocked. Nothing has ever topped that for me in terms of just pure creepiness. Like I have so many unanswered questions about that guy, and each time I think I get close to figuring it out, it just opens me up to 100 other questions. I mean, he would have had to have been on drugs to be able to pull his own tooth out like that. I don't think anyone could stand the sheer agony. And it's also the whole idea that it wasn't his first time doing it. As crazy as it sounds, he seemed to just know what he was doing. That he had to twist it and wrench it. He knew exactly how to grip it. And then the sense of pride at the end. It all just gave me this distinct feeling that he'd done that kind of thing before. I didn't see anything else that ever made me react so strongly, and after that, all the random guys just sort of playing with their junk that you'd see didn't seem to faze me at all. Like as long as there wasn't any tooth pulling, it was just water off the duck's back. So, I guess I have something to thank Mr. Tooth Puller for, although saying that it's not something I want to see again. In fact, I hope I never meet Mr. Tooth Puller online, or in real life, ever again. On the night of the 27th of October, 2013, Tavisha Paris was working his final shift as a pizza delivery driver. The 25-year-old Sri Lankan migrant had moved to the UK to pursue a degree in IT, and had long been employed as a delivery driver to support himself as he studied. But since he graduated with distinction from the University of Sheffield, Tavisha had quickly found himself a well-paid job in the IT sector. The generous pay package meant that it would be much easier to apply for permanent residence in the UK, which would open the door to eventually moving his family over too. His boss was sad to see the back of such a hard-working young man go, but also happy to see Tavisha moving onward and upward in his chosen career path. All he had to do was work one more shift, just one more night, and he'd be starting off his new life as a white-collar professional. At around 10 p.m., Tavisha would have been making one of his final runs of the night as he drove out to Southie Crescent with a customer's order. As he parked his car, unfastened his seatbelt, and opened the driver's side door, Tavisha was greeted by the looming figure of 25-year-old Qasim Ahmed. Qasim wasn't the one who ordered the pizza, but still wanted something from the delivery driver, his mobile phone. Tavisha saw a flash of steel in the dim streetlights as his mugger pulled out a knife and threatened to stab him if he didn't hand over his phone. But Tavisha was brave. Too brave, perhaps. He had worked hard to be able to afford an expensive smartphone, and he wasn't about to hand it over without a fight. There wasn't a fight that night. It was a slaughter. Without so much as an ounce of provocation, Qasim Ahmed plunged the knife into Tavisha's chest, who fell back onto the pavement, gasping as he attempted to stem the bleeding. As he lay dying, Qasim's 18-year-old partner in crime, Shamraze Khan, rifled through Tavisha's pockets to relieve him of his belongings. With just one stab wound, Tavisha might have stood a chance of surviving the attack. But Qasim knew he had seen his face, and he knew the hard-working young migrant wouldn't just take the robbery lying down. The police would be called, a report would be filed, and repeated offender Qasim would no doubt be headed back to prison. And in Qasim's mind, that just wasn't going to happen. He knelt down and began plunging the knife into Tavisha's chest over and over again, stabbing the dying delivery driver a total of 14 times until he bled to death, right there on the cold Yorkshire pavement. The local community was appalled by the brutality of the murder, but also by the horrific and painfully tragic circumstances. Just one more night on the job. If Qasim Ahmed had waited just one more day to steal a phone or a wallet, Tavisha would still be alive. It's like some cruel cosmic joke, so utterly senseless that it almost sounds made up, and many were moved by the story. Given that Tavisha worked for Domino's in the UK, the company paid for his family to fly over so they could better organize his repatriation, as well as working more closely with investigating police. Tavisha's older brother, Pramod, spoke to the media on his arrival in Britain, saying, "I'm heartbroken. My brother, Tavisha, was the center of our world. He gave us so many reasons to smile. He was kind and considerate, and we were extremely proud of his achievements. We were so happy that he was doing so well in England, and we never thought his life was in any danger. I can't believe he was taken away from us in this cruel and inhuman manner. Please, if anyone saw or heard anything that could help us to catch these murderers, we beg that you step forward to help find my brother's killers." But it wasn't long before Tavisha's killers were found. As it turned out, Qasim Ahmed had stolen the cell phones of 2 young women at knife point just an hour before he murdered Tavisha, and he'd been stupid enough to do it in downtown Sheffield, a place that's practically covered in CCTV cameras. Police tracked him down as a part of their theft investigation, only to find that Qasim was in the process of disposing of clothing that was soaked in blood of his victim. He was arrested and charged with murder, and would go on to be sent to prison for a minimum of 24 years. But 24 years seems like far too lenient a sentence for someone willing to take the life of another human being for nothing more than a mobile phone. And it seems like the only justice for a person responsible for such a cruel cosmic joke, who fabricated a scenario that would horrify all who heard it, deserves to go to prison for much, much longer than just 24 years.
When I was 17, I had the extreme misfortune of breaking both of my legs at the same time. I had been playing football with some of my friends out behind my house in a wide open field. There was a barn that had been abandoned and was slowly rotting away. The way the barn was built, it was nestled right onto the side of the hill. So you could walk around the far end of the barn, climb up the hill, and walk onto the roof. I was being a bit of a dick during the game, and I deliberately ran through what we had marked as out of bounds and ran up the hill and across the barn roof, intending to leap down off of it and score a bogus touchdown. But due to the rain, the wooden roof beams were wet and soggy, and when the wood gave out under my feet, I crashed downwards through the ceiling and landed hard on some old farming instruments, including buckets, a set of horseshoes, and a spare tire for an old tractor. I'm actually pretty lucky that I didn't get impaled by a pitchfork or anything. To make a long story short, I broke both of my legs, dislocated my left arm, and had a concussion. I was rushed to the hospital and was discharged in a wheelchair, where I was forced to stay on the ground floor of my house. One night my parents and sister decided that they wanted to go see the new Lord of the Rings movie that was playing, and kind of without warning they said they were leaving. I found myself in the house alone. At first, I didn't mind. I had complete control of the TV and could play my video games as loud as I wanted to. But before long, I got frustrated. Most of my games were upstairs where I couldn't get them, and couldn't reach the microwave or most of the higher cabinets from my wheelchair, so I was very limited on what I could do, and I began to feel very bitter. I rolled myself into the dining room without turning on the lights and peeked out into the backyard, out across the field and into the barn. I'm not sure why I wanted to look back there. It was dark out, and there wasn't much to see, but I'm the type of guy who always has to be aware of his surroundings, in order for my mind to be at peace. I looked out at the stars for a few moments, and was about to roll myself backwards and return to the kitchen, when I saw something. By the light of the moon, I saw 2 figures walk out of the barn and make their way towards my house. I froze, too nervous to even let the curtain fall back in place. I made myself stare back towards the approaching figures. They weren't just walking, they were holding hands. I remember speaking out loud, "Are those kids?" I felt most of the fear melt away, and was replaced by rage. Who were these brats trespassing on our property at 9 o'clock at night? We lived in a pretty secluded area, and it would have taken quite a lot of walking through the woods, in the dark, to enter our backyard from that direction. That's when I made my first mistake. I opened the window and called out to them, "Hey, what are you doing?" Both figures immediately stopped in their tracks, still holding hands, but otherwise keeping completely still. "Get out of our yard," I called out. There was perhaps 5 seconds of silence before one of them called out in a voice so calm it made all the terror and fear come rushing back. "Can we come in?" The voice sounded muffled, and at this point, my eyes had adjusted to the darkness. Now that I had a better look at them, I could tell that they weren't kids. I would say that they were probably teenagers, wearing white porcelain masks that had these sadistic painted smiles on them. My response died in my throat, and my hands began to shake. I slammed the window shut and wheeled myself fast back across the dining room and into the living room. I shut off the TV and lights, casting the house into darkness, and rolled into the den. I got out of my wheelchair and crawled across the floor to the window and peeked out. They were both at the same spot, still holding hands, still staring right at the house. I watched them for a few more seconds, and then one of them raised their hand and waved at me. Not in the general direction of the house, right at me. I ducked back and started freaking out and cursing. I hadn't turned on any lights. There was no way they could have seen half of my face peeking out at them from the distance in the dark. I had no idea what to do, and I didn't know if all the doors were locked, if the garage door was shut, or even when my family would be back home. I felt completely helpless, knowing that I didn't have the strength or ability to check every room in the house to make sure it was locked up tight. I went to the phone on my desk and frantically called my mom's phone, but her cell was off. She was likely in the movie. Same thing with my dad. I thought about calling the cops, but I didn't know exactly what to tell them. Sure, there was 2 people trespassing on my property, but they hadn't threatened me or attempted to break in yet. I didn't know how to put into words the sense of urgency and danger I felt. I crawled back to my wheelchair and rolled myself through the darkness and into the hallway that separated the living room and kitchen. That's when I heard a knock at the door, and I heard a muffled voice ask, "Can we come in?" I turned away from the front door and made my way towards the stairs, intending to climb them on my hands and knees, crawl to my room, and lock myself in there. My front door had a strip of narrow windows turning vertically down along the doorframe, and when I was nearly at the stairs, a masked face appeared through one of the windows, and shortly after I heard giggling. Upon making eye contact with the mask, the person crooked their head to the side. I froze like a deer in the headlights. All I could do was stare back. I remember it so perfectly. As I'm typing this, my hands are shaking. The mask disappeared from view, and that's when I noticed the deadbolt to the front door was unlocked. All anyone had to do was turn the knob, and they could walk right in. Then there was a knock on the back door, and another small muffled voice. I could barely hear what it said because of the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I shut my eyes and buried my face into my hands. I heard rattling coming from the back door. I'm not very religious, but in that moment, I prayed to whoever would listen. I'm not sure how long I sat there, crying, and waiting for one of the doors to open. But after what felt like 10 minutes, I looked up. There was no one peeking through the window at me. I slid out of my chair, crawled slowly to the stairs, and into my room, where I shut the door and locked it. I'm not positive about this last part, but right before I shut the door, I glanced down in the dark hallway, and I thought I saw the shadowy outline of a dark figure slowly tiptoeing up the stairs. I locked the door and proceeded to suffer through the longest night of my life. I never heard anything else from either inside the house or outside. My parents and sister arrived after 1 a.m., and by that time my shirt was soaked through with sweat. They thought by the look on my face I had suffered a stroke or something, and nearly called the ambulance for me. I never saw these masked people again. Of course, my parents didn't believe me. Why would they? There was no evidence that someone had broken in. It was just much easier for them to conclude that I just had a nightmare. My legs have since healed, and even though I still walk with a slight limp, there was otherwise no permanent damage. If I had to choose though, I would rather break both of my legs again, just to avoid the feeling of helplessness and terror that I felt that night. when I looked into the hollow black eyes of that porcelain mask.
It was 2002, and I decided that it was time for me to make something of myself. However, I always had a tendency to backtrack on my goals. Something that a lot of people told me was that I never give myself time to relax. So I was going to take the year off and travel across the country. I had saved up some money from the years of working, and I did the math. If I spent my money sparingly and I picked up some odd jobs along the way, I should have been more than capable of lasting the year on what I had saved. My plan was simple. I took a flight from Chicago to New York, and from there, I would travel around each state to see what the rest of the country had to offer outside of my small hometown. Things started off really well. For the first few weeks, I traveled via bus or train from city to city, enjoying as much as I could while remaining on my budget. Something I quickly found out, that it was fairly hard to snag a quick, paying job in a town you were only going to be in for a day or two. This meant that I would have to figure out a way to save a bit of money, and to be honest, I probably went about the situation the wrong way, because for some reason, the best way I could think of to save money would be if I could find a cheaper way to travel. That was when I decided to try my hand at hitchhiking. Excuse the pun. I walked along the side of a highway in Virginia for about 45 minutes, alternating between which hand I was using to attempt to flag someone down. And finally, I was happy to see a small two-door sedan slowly pull off. As I approached the passenger side door, I noticed that it was only the driver in the car. He seemed like a clean-cut and older gentleman who had no facial hair, but wore circular glasses like Lenin. He asked where I was heading, and I explained to him that any town with a cheap place to stay would be great, and he said he could drop me off in a city about 10 miles away, which sounded amazing at the time. So I thanked him graciously and hopped into the passenger seat of his car. At first, things seemed like they were going great, and it turned out that he apparently grew up not too far from me, or at least that's what he told me. Maybe he was just trying to get me to lower my guard. After we passed an off-ramp that I thought was going to take us to the city he told me about, I asked him how far away we are, and his answer was one that I never wanted to hear. He said, "We're about 3 hours away from your new home." I was confused. I began to chuckle a bit, hoping that it was some weird joke that I didn't understand. That was when I saw him press the switch to lock the doors. "What are you doing?" I asked. That's when I saw him pull a gun out from the panel of his door. He pointed the handgun in my direction and told me to just relax. And I don't know what came over me, but I knew I had to do something. I reached for the gun in hopes of either getting it from him or distracting him enough to crash his car, but he was quicker. I didn't feel the bullet hit me, but the ringing in my ears was enough to make me almost pass out. The stranger that I had entrusted had just shot me. We drove for a little while longer. I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was so dazed by the situation. The bullet had entered in the left side of my chest. I felt my eyes growing heavy, and I could hear him muttering to himself. Everything after that came to me in pieces. I vaguely remember pulling off of the highway. Then we were in the woods. I was pulled from the car and left lying next to a tree. I'll never forget the relief it felt when I heard his tires skid as he pulled away. I think he thought I was dead or going to die. Hell, I did too. Lucky for me, I still had my phone. I was able to call emergency services. It took them some time to find me, and by the time they got there, I had already passed out, assuming I would never wake up again. Thankfully, I did. I woke up in the ambulance where I was told that I was going to be fine and they were taking me to the hospital. Apparently, the bullet went in and out, meaning that it went on a straight path and didn't bounce around or break up inside of me, causing massive internal damage. I ended my trip then and there, and once I was able to fly home, I did. My friends always told me I was too trusting of strangers. Not anymore.
I used to live in a 2-story house in Boise, Idaho. Both floors were meant to serve as a single bedroom apartment. I lived on the second floor, and the floor beneath me was vacant. I entered and exited the apartment through the back deck, and would walk down a wooden stairs to the driveway. There was a door in my living room that led downstairs to the second apartment, but it was deadbolted from my side. In turn, there was a door at the bottom of the stairs that was deadbolted from the other side. The entire time I lived on the second floor apartment, I never had anyone living underneath me. I would occasionally ask the landlord why that was, and he would always shrug and say that the building had a bad reputation. It had caught fire in the late 80s and 2 people had died downstairs. One extremely stormy evening, I was watching football in my living room when the power went out. I sighed and gathered some candles and a flashlight and decided that I might as well turn in early, even though it was only about 9 o'clock. I climbed into bed, but since I wasn't very tired, I spent a good hour tossing and turning. When 10 o'clock finally came around, I was about ready to get out of bed and just start making shadow puppets with my flashlight, just to pass the time, when I heard a door slam from somewhere in the house. I shot up in bed. I knew for a fact that I was alone in my apartment, and no one was supposed to be downstairs. The next second, I heard heavy feet charging up the stairs from the downstairs apartment, and someone had begun putting their way into the door that led into my living room. I leapt out of bed and grabbed my cell phone to call the cops. I locked myself in my bedroom and frantically told the operator that there was someone in the house trying to get into my apartment. There came a tremendous banging on the other side of the door, like someone was wielding a sledgehammer or an axe, trying to break it down. The operator confirmed that she could hear what was going on, and that the police were on their way. I stayed on the line for what felt like another hour, hysterically telling the operator who my parents were, and to tell them I loved them in case I died. In retrospect, I probably should have just grabbed my keys and simply leapt out of my bedroom window and into the driveway and floored it out of there in my car. But I wasn't exactly thinking straight. I was convinced that I was about to die. When the police arrived, their wailing alarms drowned out the noise of the thunder and rain. They breached the house from the ground floor, and I heard them beneath me screaming, "Police!" and the noise on the staircase abruptly stopped. I heard more of the policemen on the back deck, knocking on the glass of the sliding door, and I ran out of my bedroom to let them in. Before I could even ask if they caught the intruder, they quickly rushed me out of the house and into the rain, claiming that the house was on fire. I waited in a patrol car in my pajamas, pretty damn wet and upset as the policemen ran in and out of the building with flashlights. After the fire truck had arrived, a police officer got into the car with me and offered me a towel, and then started to ask me questions about the intruder. I told him all that I knew, which wasn't much. The officer then explained that upon entering the house, the bottom door of the stairs was deadbolted shut, as was my door at the top of the stairs, and there was absolutely no damage to either door. Upon entering the house, the officers were overwhelmed by the smell of smoke and immediately called the fire department, assuming there were flames raging inside the walls. Despite the smell, the firemen concluded that there was no fire anywhere, and besides myself, there was absolutely no evidence that anyone had been in the house. The landlord arrived shortly after, as I sat in my living room in the dark, drinking whiskey right out of the bottle, muttering about how I wasn't crazy. I definitely heard the sound of someone attacking the door. He told me that the previous tenants who lived downstairs had been a single father and his disabled son. One night, the son had accidentally set a fire to the carpet in the living room, and the father and son were both trapped in the stairway, unable to open the door to the second floor, and had died of smoke inhalation. I moved out the following month.
The pandemic has been pretty hard on all of us, and we've all felt its effects in a variety of ways, but musicians have felt it more than most. I don't mean to throw myself a pity party or anything. I know there are older folks who are actually fearing for their lives, so I've counted my blessings plenty of times. But for most of my friends, the pandemic just meant working from home or taking a long paid vacation. For me, it meant work dried up entirely. As a professional musician, I've been playing music both solo and with bands for most of my adult life now. It's fun, but it can be really tough on occasion, and this pandemic has been the toughest time I'd ever experienced. I had to do something, anything to pay the bills, so when the drummer in my band said that he was making some pretty decent money for working for Postmates, it immediately sparked my interest. I think the real selling point was how it had benefited his health. Us musicians tend to be much more familiar with a bottle and a glass than an elliptical machine, so riding a bike and getting paid to do it seemed like a great way to get back into a fitness regimen. So, dust off my young brother's old mountain bike, oil up the gears, get myself a Postmates driver's account, and I'm pretty much ready to go. I mean, it's kind of messed up that there were no background checks or anything. Like, I literally could have been anyone, but hey, I wasn't complaining at the time. I needed the money, I needed it bad, and there were much worse things than delivering acai bowls that I could be doing. But being a delivery driver brought a whole host of new occupational hazards, and there was one particular incident in the summer of last year that I've thought about almost every single day since it happened. So, I get this one job delivering Thai food over to a place in Brentwood, just this little single-story house that barely stood out from the rest. Postmates has us doing the whole contactless delivery thing by that point, but I always used to hang around just to make sure whoever it was got their food. Sometimes you had some pretty elderly people ordering from us, since some didn't have any other means of getting food without exposing themselves. It meant a lot to me to know that I was helping like that, even if it was in such a small way. Anyway, the dude comes out to get his food, and he's not nearly as old or infirm as I first expected, but he does look tired. And not just like my neighbor's dog was barking last night kind of tired. He looked like he was over his own life, just a deep exhaustion set into his eyes. He thanked me through his mask and told me Postmates had been a godsend since his wife left. I could relate hard to that. My long-term girlfriend had left at the start of the pandemic too. She just couldn't handle the stress. Couldn't be so far away from her parents during such a difficult time, so I knew what he was talking about. Like I said, he seemed sick and tired, but he didn't hint at actually being depressed or mad or anything like that. He just seemed to be doing that macho guy thing of internalizing all of his feelings, and again, hard relate. Like I said, I often stuck around to make sure people got their food, and I'd also make a point of thanking people if they tipped big, and boy, did tired guy tip big. Right as I'm about to ride off on my bike, I make a point of telling the guy how grateful I am that he was so generous with his tip. It's literally people like him that mean I don't have to pawn my guitars to pay the rent. He just kind of nods, then says, "Just don't make the same mistakes I did, kid." I wasn't a kid. I was 28, but the weight of experience in the guy's voice, I just took it on the chin. The very next day, I get another delivery up that way, so I decide to cycle past the guy's house. I'm not 100% sure why, I guess I'm a creature of habit or something. But as I roll up, I can already see that something is horribly wrong. There's a cop car sitting in the guy's driveway, and his gate is blocked off with blue and white police tape. There's one cop sat in the driver's seat of the cruiser, and he gets out to ask me why I'm gawping at a crime scene. I ask him what happened, and he tells me to move along before turning his back on me. But then on the fly, I say "But, officer, that's my uncle's place." And I drop the same name he'd used for his Postmates delivery. As soon as I say that, the cop stops dead in his tracks and turns around and sighs. That's when I know it wasn't just some home invasion or a car theft or something. That's when I knew it was darker than I could have imagined. The cop says something like, "Look, I'm sorry, but you're better hearing this from the next of kin. Besides, homicide doesn't have a full picture of what happened yet." "Is he okay? Is my uncle okay?" I ask. He was taken to the hospital, but After that, I'm not sure. I'm so sorry, sir. I had to do my own research to find out what exactly actually happened, and to me, it was way worse than home invasion or something. The older guy, the one who'd been so generous with his money and his advice, had a full-on mental breakdown the very same day that I brought him his food. From what I could gather, he'd been ranting and raving in his driveway, and then when the cops showed up, he waved a gun in their faces, and that's all she wrote. They shot him dead right there in his driveway. I don't know if he was trying to end his own life by cop or he actually had some kind of mental breakdown, but if it all happened that same night I dropped his food off, then I basically fed this guy his last meal, the final thing that ever passed his lips. A couple of hours later, he was dead. I don't know why, but that messed with me something awful over the weeks that followed. I kept thinking that maybe if I'd stuck around, maybe if I asked him more about his problems or his life in general, maybe it had given him the strength to carry on, at least for a little while. Or maybe it was always going to happen. Maybe he'd planned it or something, and nothing I could have said would have made a difference. For the longest time, those were the kinds of thoughts that I just couldn't seem to shake. Like the guy was a ghost that just haunted me, no matter where I went, or what I did.
You know, they tell you not to pick up hitchhikers, and when I was younger, I always thought that was a very cynical way to view people, assuming that they were inherently up to no good. However, as an adult, and having had experienced something almost terrible happen to me in one of the most unforeseen ways, I'm certainly wary of roadside travelers. You see, I was driving down the road about 5 years ago, and it wasn't on the highway or anything, but the speed limit was 45, which to someone standing still is pretty fast. As I was making my way down the road, I noticed an older woman standing along the side of the road. She looked to be around 50 years old, and in her arms, she was cradling what looked like a blue blanket. So immediately I assumed it was a mother and her child stranded on the side of the road. I decided to pull up to the woman and ask her if everything was okay, and that was when she told me that her ex-husband had kicked her and her baby out on the side of the road after the two had an argument. So I asked if I could help in any way, and she asked if it wouldn't be too much trouble on my part to give her a ride to town, which was only about 2 miles away. I figured it was no problem. The only issue was that I didn't have a car seat for the baby, though she assured me that since it was such a short ride, she would hold him in her arms as long as I drove slow and safely. So she hopped in the car and we were off, and about a minute into the drive, I couldn't help but notice that she hadn't taken her eyes off of me. It was like she was staring daggers into my head, and when I finally turned to face her, I noticed that she had put the blanket down on her lap. It was empty. She hadn't been carrying a child at all. Instead, in her right hand, she was now wielding a small knife of sorts. As soon as my eye line went toward the knife, the woman began to get very aggressive. She began yelling at me, but I couldn't make out a single word that she was saying. I begged her to please calm down. Just tell me what she wanted. All I can really remember is asking her not to hurt me. This was when she pushed the knife lightly against the side of my neck and told me not to try anything. All she wanted was my car and my phone, and then everything would be okay. She told me to slowly pull over, and I complied without question. I was fully prepared to give her my car. I knew that my life was worth more than my belongings. But then she made a mistake I would have never expected her to make. After I put the car in park, instead of forcing me out of the car and then hopping into the driver's seat herself, the woman with the knife unlocked her door and got out of the car. She told me to stay there, and she began to walk around to the driver's side. I saw the opportunity and threw my car in reverse. I pushed the gas down just enough to gain traction, and then I forced it into reverse. Once I was about 100 feet down the road from the woman, I put the car back into drive and sped past her as fast as I could. After I got back to my house, I notified the police, and they said they would look into the situation. But other than that, I haven't heard anything. All I know is that looks can be deceiving. I thought I was helping an innocent woman and her child, but in reality, I almost became a victim.
This happened when I was in the 2nd grade of elementary school. One night, my parents had to leave to attend a wake, and they left me home alone to house sit. They told me that I was in charge of the house. I was to eat dinner, take a shower, and go to bed. They said that they would be back after midnight. I'd never been alone in the house before. It was really strange, but I wanted to enjoy this newfound freedom. So I was watching TV and feeling really powerful, as I could choose whichever channel I wanted. We live in the rural countryside of Kyushu. Our neighbors are a couple of minutes away, so nights are usually very calm and quiet. I think it was about 8 or 9 o'clock. I had just finished watching a TV show, and the news came on. Boring, I thought. I guess it was time to take a shower and hit the hay. I was contemplating this massive decision while reading a manga comic laying down on the bed. Then I heard a knock at the door. Oh, my parents came back early, I thought, as I went to the door. I looked through the frosted glass, and I saw the big shadow of a person there. My mom was only around 4'9", so it couldn't have been her. Maybe it's my dad, I assumed. I called out, "Hello?" A deep male voice replied, "Hi, little girl. Is your dad home?" My dad was a bit of a drinker, and he often hung out with booze hounds. I thought that this might have been one of his pals or something, so I carelessly responded, "No, he's not here. He's at a funeral." There was a short pause. "And what about your mother?" I didn't know what to say. I knew my mom hung out with her friends, and they went drinking too, so maybe this guy knew both of them. But something told me not to reply. I felt a bit suspicious. What do I do? I thought that no matter what I would answer with, I might end up making another mistake or getting into trouble somehow. "Mom's not home either," the voice persisted. This was so strange. We never usually had people coming to the house at this time of night. This wasn't right. There was something about his voice too. It didn't sound like the local accent. This wasn't good. I felt extremely anxious, and I couldn't bring myself to say anything in response. "Are you alone in there, little girl?" I began to cry silent tears while standing still and silent. "Can't you open the door for me? I have something I have to give to your dad. I'm just here to drop it off," he said in a voice so extremely sickly. The kind of voice you hear when you're trying to coax someone into doing something. I mustered up enough strength to reply, "Can you come back tomorrow?" He didn't reply. He just started to violently turn the doorknob. I understood this man's intentions now, and it felt like an arrow of ice went through my heart. My throat closed up and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. Then came the sound of his fist punching the frosted glass. "Open it," he roared again and again. "Please stop," I pleaded. "It's so loud," I said. Then my brain kicked into gear, and I ran into the living room and grabbed the house phone. I didn't even know the number of the place where my parents were at. My parents had told me about people who will call the police when they don't need their help. Hoax calls. I was nervous, thinking I might get into trouble for one of these calls. While I was panicking about what to do, I heard the glass shatter in the hallway. He had breached the door. A horrible, thick arm shot through the hole. I remember he was wearing a jet black jumper. I screamed for help. I remember thinking this was more like a scene from a movie, not from real life. The arm was searching for the lock. While the arm was desperately probing for the lock, I heard another scream coming from outside. It was someone shouting my name, someone shouting that they called the police. I wandered over to the door and I saw the owner of the new voice. I jumped for joy. It was the voice of the older lady who lived next door. She had heard all the commotion and came to see what was going on. As she shouted that she called the police, the man ran for it. I let her in. I was inconsolable. I just bawled my eyes out the whole night through. The police arrived about 30 minutes before my parents came back. When my parents did come back, they apologized again and again for leaving me by myself. In the end, we didn't know who the intruder was. My dad assumed it was a robbery attempt. Just as a side note, our town is located along the East China Sea in Kyushu, and there are a lot of suspicious ships around the ports. In addition, my hometown is famed for many unsolved missing person cases. We never found the man, but I often replay that moment in my head over and over. Thanks to that man, I have had countless sleepless nights. I don't like to think about what might have happened to me if my neighbor hadn't been there. We've become very close with our neighbors after this, and my parents never let me house sit again.
This story took place when I was 23 years old, close to 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit, and one morning before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years my senior, but during this particular fight, he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, then why don't you go back to the Bronx?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my Uggs and my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and flew out of the house. I am unfortunately an impulsive idiot and didn't think to grab my cell phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option was to walk. I don't think at the time that I intended to walk back to the Bronx, as I was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just needed to go for an angry, dramatic walk. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me, as I had only lived there for a few months at that point and we really didn't go out a lot. I banked left and just walked and walked where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I saw my then-boyfriend driving by on his way to work, and he sped up as he drove past me, evidently still angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow, and I was losing momentum. I passed by a VFW where a nondescript pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I had passed it that I even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me, "Hey, honey, do you need help?" My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept this stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal older white guy. Gray hair, greenish-blue eyes, just average. I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or bad guy?" And cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. He answered, "I'm a good guy. I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy, would I?" I ignored the bells going off in my head and got in the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my destination. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask where I was going. I called her 3 times and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing pajamas. I explained I was originally from the Bronx and that I had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused and said, "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?" I chuckled nervously and said, "Oh, no thanks though." He responded, "Well, I just figured since you said you were from the Bronx," and trailed off. Realizing at that point I was almost definitely in deep doo-doo, I muttered, "Oh, sure. He eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering. Sure, she says. I started to panic big time, but knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could land in if I leapt out of the truck, to no avail. The houses were so few and far in between, I became certain this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's full name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband and how they used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving to the promised land. I sheepishly asked his name. "Steve," he said, and then asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a nonsense thank you, and ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed through the front door and locked it behind me. I immediately start crying and running through the house trying to find my friend's mom. I had awoken her from a sound sleep, but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything. The fight, the fleeing, the weird guy and his proposition, and she listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless again, and that if I ever needed her, to call her. She told me she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's later that same day and got really stoned and tried to forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a dangerous person who her husband had cut off communication with years ago. The last he had heard about Steve was that he had been arrested for assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road, and no one would even know where to look for me. Not to mention, I might not even been found until the snow thawed out.